In this lecture, I want to give an overview of some select features of Roman society, culture, politics. It'll provide a foil for you, a background for us to look at the Jewish society, culture, and politics. And we want to kind of fast forward to the time of Jesus. Some of these institutions we talk about obviously have a history dating way before Christ, but we want to hone in to the situation and circumstances at the time of Christ. Roman provincial administration and governments, you can read about this in Ferguson's book on page 40 to 47. We need to know that at the time of Jesus, Rome was the dominant power and governed all of the entire region. Rome had learned from Greece that they needed to use client kings, just like Persia also learned that. In other words, if you totally move people around to other locations so that they lose their identity, they don't make compliant captives. So you want to turn them into useful allies, and Rome did that. So we're looking to establish areas in the empire who would express loyalty to Rome, and that viewed Rome as a benefactor or a patron. So in return for the benefits that Rome provided, they would in fact pay taxes and in time of conquest provide military aid. One of the things that made Herod the Great so popular with the Romans was the fact that he had extraordinary military experts, and he rendered tremendous aid to the Romans. For instance, he supported Pompey against Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar wins, he then pleads his allegiance to Caesar. When Caesar is killed at Te Brute, he then supports Antony and Cleopatra. And when Octavius defeats Antony, he then supports Octavius. So not only was he an opportunist, switching loyalties back and forth, he was also rendered valuable service to the victors, men and supplies. And Rome saw him as an asset, not a liability. So they made him governor. As long as he kept the coffers of Rome filled with taxes, they saw him as an asset. So what were some of the expectations of Rome? Well, first, that the people being governed would help the Roman authorities maintain the Pax Romana, that they would not foment revolt. They would establish peace and enforce that by the power of Rome. Second, Rome would provide protection, and for their taxes sent to Rome, there would be development and infrastructure. Rome would build aqueducts, like the aqueduct put into Caesarea Maritima and into several of them into Jerusalem, roads all through Palestine with road markers, the Wettig Mara, the one that runs along the sea, and the one that goes over into the north area by the Sea of Galilee. Bridges also. It would look like a benefactor, and for everybody, they wanted to make it kind of a win-win situation, at least in theory. There also needed to be, on the part of the conquered people, a realization that Rome was exhibiting an ethnic sensitivity and was giving them some freedom to express their ethnic identity. Of course, Rome recognized that the people they conquered had an identity and a culture and a religion of their own. And if they did not recognize this and respect it, it would actually work against the Pax Romana. So it would foment all kinds of unrest and eventually revolts, such as we see the Zealot revolt in Palestine in 66 AD. Now, let me illustrate this very quickly. Pontius Pilate was appointed prefect in the Roman province of Palestine that was administratively under Syrian provincial governor. But Pilate was not ethnically sensitive. He didn't like the Jews, and the Jews didn't like him. And he went out of his way sometimes to harass them to bring about unrest. In fact, he reigned about 10 years, 26 to 36 AD. He appointed Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard in Rome, who was also anti-Jewish. Tiberius was away at Capri and left him in charge. And some of the things he did was, well, you can read this on page 416 in Ferguson's book. It was to, for example, to introduce Roman standards with embossed images of the emperor into the temple itself. Now, the Jews regarded that as an idolatrous act. Also, he used temple funds, stole the temple treasury, which was considered korban, dedicated to God, and he built an aqueduct, and that was okay, but it was actually used sacred funds set aside for the maintenance of the temple in order to build that aqueduct. He introduced shields into the city bearing the emperor's name, Tiberius, and the subtitle, "The Son of the Deified Augustus." Again, right in your face insult to the Jewish people. So he was brutal in the suppression of unrest as well. At one point, he dispersed his soldiers into a crowd that was protesting, and they were disguised as Jews wearing plain clothes and robes. And under the robes, they had hidden clubs. And when they found out who the leaders were, they proceeded to beat them to death. Harsh treatment of the Samaritans as well. The Council of the Samaritans went to Vitellius, governor of Syria, to protest that their purposes were religious, not rebellious. Vitellius removed Pilate from office and dispatched him to Rome to give an account to the emperor. These and other problems eventually led him being deposed, sent to Rome, and banished. So ethnic sensitivity is what Rome expected, and of course that would be in line with what the Greeks and the Persians did. Not perfectly, but it certainly was better than what Pilate did. Okay, let's look at the structure of provincial governance. At the time of Christ, Palestine was part of the Roman province of Syria. That's why Pilate was deposed by the legate of Syria at the request of the Samaritans. Normally, the prefects of Judea were free from interference from Samaria, except for in serious offenses. The provincial capital was Caesarea Maritima, built by Herod the Great, 22 BC. There was a detachment of soldiers at the Roman garrison and at that seaport. In peaceful provinces, there were no legions. 10 of them were administered by the Senate. Senatorial provinces were ruled by proconsul, in the place of the consul, Acts 19:38, or functioning with the power of a consul in the senatorial provincia. By the way, there were 2 consuls who ruled over the city of Rome. Then there were imperial provinces. So senatorial provinces, imperial provinces, where military were assigned. For example, Syria was an imperial province. That's why both Syria and Palestine had troops there. It usually had a legion or auxiliary troops. This was because of the danger of uprising or the lack of progress toward internal civilization, as they would call it. They would rule by Augustus himself through a senator called a legate, who functioned as the governor. Small, troublesome areas like Judea were under a special governor, though, a member of the equestrian order, who had command of auxiliary troops, not legions. In the period before Claudius, their title was prefect. The Greek term is hegemon. Hegemon, the term in the Greek New Testament is the term used for Pilate. The Latin term prefectus became translated in the King James as prefect. But he's really a hegemon. So the inscription stone on Caesarea Maritima confirms Pontius Pilate's title as governor of Judah was in fact prefect. After Claudius, these governors or prefects were called procurators. Now, procurators were finance officers, although prefect emphasizes military command and procurator financial responsibility. The office in Palestine after Claudius combined military, financial, and judicial authority. Pompey puts down a Hasmonean dispute, remember that, between John Hyrcanus II and Aristippus II in 63 BC. From then on, Israel was not an independent nation, but under Roman yoke. When Pompey entered the Holy of Holies, the Jewish shock we saw was written out in the Psalms of Solomon. So that was really a day of the Lord, according to the Jews, an eschatological day, a day when God would bring forth redemption from Roman rule. Roman society was stratified but was not closed. Now this part of Roman genius. Rome made an opportunity for people to move up and down within Roman society. Not totally open, but there was the possibility of some mobility. How could you do that? Well, through several ways. First, through military prowess, being promoted from leader of a contubernia, which is 8 men, to centurion, a leader of a century, that's 100 men, or 10 contubernia, that's really 80 men plus 20 administrators. And then there's the prefect, a leader of a cohort, which is 6 centuria, that's 480 men. But only aristocrats could be a legate. A legate was a leader of a legion, which had 10 cohorts in it. The legate's army staff was senatorial tribunes. The real professionals of the Roman legions were the centurions. There were 60 centurions in a legion, and promotion over a long career could take a man from junior centurion, hatus posteria it was called, of the 10th cohort, to the centurion of the 1st cohort, who he was called then the primus pilis, or a praefectus caestorium, the camp prefect. There was no fixed period of service for a man once he reached the centurionate. He could stay till he died. If he retired after 25 years, he was granted a social status of equestrian. You could also move up through attaining wealth. In the New Testament, we have Corinthian businessmen like Erastus, Philippian businesswoman Lydia. Since business and trade were considered beneath the dignity of senators, many amassed great wealth in these pursuits. If one had the right talent, he could become more important than if he were in the Senate. And here's the aristocracy, the senatorial class, the order. Augustus set the roll of senatorial families at 600. There was a minimum property qualification of 250,000 denarii. You can see page 93 for the value of a denarius. For admission to the Senate, that was 250,000 denarii. Membership in the Senate was actually obtained by filling one of the principal magistracies of Rome, either questor, praetor, or consul. The sign of a senatorial standing was a broad purple stripe on his toga. The consul, 2 were elected annually. The praetor were judges, 12 chosen each year. A questor was a financial function. There was 20 per year chosen. Roman cities in the west followed the city of Rome's pattern. Zealous imitation of Rome, really. A consul in the city of Rome, but also called a devor in the Roman colony, like the city of Philippi. Under them there were 2 aediles, superintendents of buildings and public works. In Corinth, one aedile was Erastus, the city treasurer mentioned in Romans 16:23. And some cities also had quaestors to handle financial administration. So who were the equestrian rank? On page 57 you can read that the knights, equates, were a much larger group with a property qualification over 100,000 denarii. Their name is derived in earlier times when a man could outfit his own horse for war, and so was named an equestrian. The political distinction from senators was not always social or even economic. The knights were often wealthy, educated, and related to senatorial families. A few sons of knights in each generation went into the Senate, and those sons of senators who chose not to follow a political career became knights. Besides being born into the order, one could advance the equestrian rank through wealth or through promotion in the army. Among the posts open to equestrians were the following: military, as legionary tribunes, or financial procurators in management of mines or other imperial states or properties, or financial offices in the provinces. Bureaucratic and administrative prefectures, secretaries of the state in Rome, in command of the fire and the police brigade in Rome, in charge of food supply in Rome, in command of the Praetorian Guard as governors or small provinces. So the equestrian order flourished because it was less exposed to an emperor's jealousy and faced no barrier in pursuing commercial enterprises. So the equestrian rank was granted rather freely in the second half of the 1st century. Within the order there were considerable gradations of wealth, birth, and rank according to the office held. So the municipal councils or senates called curia, men of the council called decurions. On the top of the municipal aristocracies around the empire were the decurions, the members of the municipal senates. Decurions had to be rich. They had megabucks. They paid heavily for the prestige of civic magistry and a leading role in the affairs of the community. They financed the public buildings that would be in the cities, and their names, of course, would be on that. The temples, the foundations, the bath, the theaters, all that with a placard on a grant statue to them. And also they provided food in time of emergency, providing public entertainment. They had an economic and social reason for maintaining public order and supporting the ruling power. The non-aristocracy, we start with the plebeians. Who are they? They're the citizens, the right to own property, the right to marry, the right of appeal, and legal remedies. Those were rights within citizenship, and they were the plebeians, the right even to vote. The privileges of citizenship. But remember that citizenship was only by city. They knew nothing of regional or empire citizenship. So where you were born, if your father and mother was a citizen, you would be a citizen of that town. You could also buy your citizenship by usually 100 denarii in some cities. But in bigger cities like Rome, it would take greater wealth. Or if you were a retired military, you were granted Roman citizenship. So by the time of Jesus, under Tiberius, the plebeians had lost most of their political power because so many of them were going into the military, retiring as centurions, and that they didn't want to give too much power to non-Romans. But elections were not carried out by the people. The elections were carried out by the Senate, and so they were kind of marginalized later during the time of Jesus. So who else? We have a list of free persons of different kinds. They're not slaves, but have no citizen rights. They may be residents. And there were a lot of residents in cities that had no rights whatsoever. Technically, didn't even have the right to marry somebody in the city. They had no right to property. They had no right to, they were transients, for example, in Corinth and Ephesus. These were the rural folks who operated farms outside the cities. They were free to sell their products in the city after paying the crop tax, but that's all they had. Then there were foreign types of free people. These foreigners were called peregrini. Citizenship, of course, allowed dual citizenship to reward loyalty or service to Rome. For example, Paul, born a citizen of Tarsus and of Rome. And McRae thinks that in his book, Paul the Apostle, thinks Paul's father provided tents to Pompey's army when he was conquering Syria. Tarsus in Cilicia was under Syrian rule, or an entire city could be designated a Roman colony with direct administrative control by Rome. For example, Philippi was a Roman colony. Why? Because soldiers could then retire there, and their residents were granted Roman citizenship. And then, because of their connection with the Greek culture, there was a group called the Metrics. They were resident aliens in Greek cities. They were distinct from other foreigners. They had a higher status because of their education. Quintilian provides an attractive summary in Latin of the rhetorical educational ideal at the end of the 1st century. Since reading was done aloud, the spoken word had a great influence on literature. Speech was the queen of studies. The rhetoric was the queen of studies. In both the University of Tarsus, the university that was in Alexandria, and the great universities all through the Roman Empire taught, first of all, rhetoric. The teaching of both rhetoric and philosophy was accompanied by one of three ways: by wandering popular lecturers, by private teachers established in cities, or by institutions of learning and educational centers like Athens and Alexandria. Finally, you had the slaves, the cheap labor force, the basic elements, the working class in ancient society. They were also numerous at one point. The Roman citizen passed a regulation that prohibited slaves from wearing a distinct kind of clothing when in public, because wearing slave garb was only allowed then indoors from that point on. They didn't want slaves to realize how many of them there actually were and how formidable they could be by their sheer numbers in the Roman cities. I have a whole section on slavery. You can read over that. Please look at that carefully. There's one more important thing we need to talk about, and that's patron-citizen client relationships. Very basic to Greco-Roman society. This will bleed over into what we will see in the New Testament when Paul went to the Gentiles on his missionary journeys. The society that was there was Roman. All throughout the empire, wherever Paul went, there were patron-client relationships. At the heart of this, the Gentile society and culture involved this. What does it mean? Well, it's a principle, a social principle of obligation and duty. It defines one's responsibility to one's place or rank in society. A wealthy patron gained honor by helping a client. to accomplish some worthy goal, such as building a temple, setting up a business, to go to school, to learn a trade. And this tied into the honor-shame code of ethics as well. In Roman society, everyone had a duty to show respect and honor to those above them. But even more honor could be gained by being someone's patron. The client was obligated to openly praise the generosity and virtues of their patrons. This was true in Jewish society, where everyone's obligated to honor the scholar, required them to stand when a rabbi would enter the room, but never required to honor all those above them, much less sing their praises. But in Roman society, no matter who you were in the socioeconomic or cultural spectrum, you had a duty to honor and respect those above you by providing some service to them. So this defines relationships between haves and have-nots, the haves and the have-mores. The patron would give money or dole out something needed or wanted by the client. So it could be a senator doling out a position to be an equestrian, or a equestrian could be publicly honored. The equestrian would then publicly honor the senator for the blessing and the support he received. So this is an interesting parallel. Romans 16:1 and 2, Phoebe, a servant of the church of Cenchrea, as acting as patron of Paul and the church. She is probably helping Paul financially while ministering in the church 2 miles away, but also hosting a church in her own house, and as such is not called a ruler or a head, like she would normally be in that society as a patron. But she's called a diakonos, a Greek word meaning a servant, ministering to them instead of being served, and granting access to herself instead of lording her position as patron over the church. Now, this is an example of the gospel transforming society's norms, of a wealthy person feeling obligated to bless and give without to be a patron as expected by a Roman background, but then not to lord it over Paul or the church, but to rather serve. As such, she became an example to the church. You can also read all the details in the patron-client relationship, all the particular things that are part of the discussion that's in our textbooks and found elsewhere in other literature.